Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other soldiers in her unit. While they spent their evenings cleaning weapons and sharing war stories, she studied medical journals by flashlight in her tent. The other soldiers saw her as soft, someone who belonged in a hospital, rather than on the front lines of Afghanistan. The 82nd Airborne Division had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Chapman for 3 months. Sarah was the only female medic in Alpha Company, and despite her extensive medical training, the infantry soldiers treated her like she was made of glass. They would politely decline her offers to carry extra gear, speak in hushed tones when she was around, and generally act like she might break if they looked at her wrong. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres was the worst of them all. A veteran of 2 previous deployments, he had made it clear from day one that he didn't think women belonged in combat zones. "Nothing personal, Doc," he would say, using the nickname all medics earned regardless of their actual rank. "It's just that when bullets start flying, we need to know everyone can handle themselves." Sarah had tried to prove herself countless times. She had volunteered for every patrol, carried more than her share of equipment, and had successfully treated dozens of soldiers for everything from heat exhaustion to shrapnel wounds. But none of it seemed to matter. To them, she was still just the medic who needed protection, rather than someone who could provide it. The base was located in a strategic valley that served as a supply route between 2 major cities. Intelligence reports suggested that Taliban forces were planning something big, but the exact nature of the threat remained unclear. Sarah had noticed increased radio chatter during her shifts in the medical tent, and the commanding officers seemed more tense than usual. During morning briefings, Colonel Harrison would stress the importance of staying alert, but Sarah could see that some of the soldiers had grown complacent after months of routine patrols with minimal contact. They joked about the vacation deployment and counted down the days until they could go home. Sarah knew better. She had been reading the medical reports from other bases in the region, and the casualty rates were increasing. Improvised explosive devices were becoming more sophisticated, and enemy tactics were evolving. She had even requested additional medical supplies, anticipating that they might be needed soon. Her requests were often met with patronizing smiles. "Don't worry so much, Doc," Torres had said just last week. "We've got everything under control out here." But Sarah wasn't worried about their ability to fight. She was worried about their ability to survive what was coming. The signs were all there for anyone willing to see them. The local population had become increasingly distant. Market vendors were closing their shops earlier, and children who used to wave at passing patrols now watched from doorways with serious expressions. One evening, as Sarah organized her medical kit for the 100th time, Private Johnson approached her tent. He was one of the younger soldiers, barely 19 years old, and unlike the others, he had always treated her with genuine respect. "Doc, can I ask you something?" he said, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Of course, Johnson. What's on your mind? Do you ever feel like something bad is going to happen? Like really bad?" Sarah looked up from her supplies and studied his face. She could see the same concern in his eyes that she felt in her gut. "What makes you ask that?" "I don't know. Just a feeling, I guess. The locals seem different lately. And my grandmother always said to trust your instincts." Sarah nodded slowly. "Your grandmother sounds like a smart woman. It's always better to be prepared for the worst and hope for the best." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her cot, listening to the sounds of the base around her. Guard towers reported all clear every hour. Generators hummed steadily, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear muffled conversations from the soldiers on night watch. She thought about her family back home in Texas. Her mother, a nurse, had been proud when Sarah decided to join the military as a medic. "You'll save lives," she had said. "That's the most important job anyone can have." But here, surrounded by soldiers who saw her as a liability rather than an asset, Sarah sometimes wondered if she was making any difference at all. Tomorrow would bring another patrol, another chance to prove herself, and another day of being treated like she didn't belong. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah had no idea that within 48 hours everything would change. The Taliban fighters moving through the mountains under cover of darkness were already in position, and the attack that would test every soldier on the base was less than 2 days away. The last thing she remembered before sleep took her was checking her medical kit one more time, making sure everything was exactly where it needed to be. It was a habit that would soon save lives in ways she never could have imagined. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Sarah woke before dawn, completed her physical training routine, and joined the other soldiers for breakfast in the mess tent. The conversation was typical military banter. Complaints about the food, jokes about home, and speculation about when their deployment would end. Staff Sergeant Torres announced the day's patrol assignments. Alpha Company would be conducting a routine supply escort to the nearby village of Kandahar. It was a mission they had completed dozens of times before, following the same route through the valley that had become as familiar as their own base. "Martinez, you're staying behind today," Torres said without looking at her. "We've got enough medical coverage with Johnson's first aid training." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. Johnson was a good soldier, but his medical training consisted of a basic combat lifesaver course. If someone was seriously injured, his skills would be inadequate. "Sergeant, I really think I should go. The intel reports suggest increased enemy activity in the area." Torres finally looked at her, his expression showing mild irritation. "Doc, I appreciate your concern, but we need you here at base. What if someone gets injured while we're gone?" It was the same excuse he always used, and they both knew it. The base had other medical personnel, including a fully equipped aid station. Sarah bit back her frustration and nodded. "Understood, Sergeant." As the convoy prepared to leave, Sarah watched from the medical tent. 12 soldiers loaded into 3 Humvees, their weapons cleaned and ready. Private Johnson caught her eye and gave her a small wave before climbing into the second vehicle. She waved back, fighting the uneasy feeling that had been growing stronger all morning. The convoy departed at 0800 hours, disappearing into the dusty landscape beyond the base perimeter. Sarah threw herself into her work, conducting medical inventories and updating soldier health records. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At 1000 hours, the radio crackled to life. "Base, this is Alpha 1. We're approaching Checkpoint Charlie. All clear so far." Sarah paused her paperwork to listen. Checkpoint. Charlie was halfway to the village, a spot where the road narrowed between 2 rocky hills. She had always thought it looked like the perfect place for an ambush, but the route had been used safely for months. The next radio check came at 10:30, then 1100. Each time, Torres reported normal progress and no signs of enemy activity. Sarah began to relax slightly, thinking perhaps her instincts had been wrong this time. At 11:45, the radio exploded with panicked voices. "Base, base. We're taking heavy fire at Checkpoint Charlie. Multiple casualties. We need immediate support." The voice was Johnson's, high-pitched with adrenaline and fear. Sarah's blood went cold as she heard automatic weapons fire crackling through the radio speaker. "Alpha 1, this is base. Report your status," came the reply from the command post. Torres's voice came through next, but it was strained and breathing hard. "Base, we've got wounded. Doc Martinez. We need Martinez out here now." Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the chaos. "Martinez, get your gear. We're sending you out with a quick reaction force in 5 minutes." Sarah was already moving, grabbing her medical bag and extra supplies. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind was racing. She had trained for this moment countless times, but hearing the fear in her fellow soldiers' voices made it real in a way that exercises never could. The quick reaction force consisted of 8 soldiers and 2 Humvees. As they raced toward the ambush site, Sarah could hear the ongoing firefight through the radio. The Taliban had chosen their position well, setting up on the high ground where they could pour down fire on the trapped convoy. "Martinez," said Corporal Davis, the QRF leader, "Torres specifically asked for you. That's got to feel pretty good, right?" Sarah didn't respond. She wasn't thinking about validation or proving herself anymore. She was thinking about Johnson's frightened voice and the fact that Torres, who never admitted weakness, had specifically called for her help. As they approached Checkpoint Charlie, the sound of gunfire became audible even over the Humvee's engine. Sarah could see smoke rising from behind the rocky outcropping where the convoy was pinned down. Her medical training kicked in, and she began mentally preparing for what she might find. The QRF Humvees took position behind cover, and Sarah grabbed her medical bag. "Where do you need me?" she asked Davis. "The convoy is about 200 meters ahead behind those rocks. Torres says they've got at least 3 wounded, maybe more." Sarah nodded, checked her weapon, and prepared to move forward. She had no idea that in the next few hours, she would not only prove her medical skills, but would also demonstrate the kind of courage under fire that would earn her the respect she had been seeking all along. The battle at Checkpoint Charlie was just beginning, and Sarah Martinez was about to discover what she was truly capable of when everything was on the line. Sarah sprinted across the open ground toward the pinned-down convoy, her medical bag bouncing against her hip with each step. Bullets whistled overhead, kicking up small explosions of dirt around her feet. She had never been under direct fire before, but her training took over, and she found herself moving in the zigzag pattern she had practiced countless times. She dove behind the disabled lead Humvee, just as a burst of automatic fire peppered the ground where she had been running. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her hands remained steady as she assessed the situation. Torres was pressed against the rear of the vehicle, blood seeping through his uniform sleeve. When he saw her, relief flooded his face. "Martinez! Thank God you're here. We've got 3 down, maybe 4. Sarah could see the wounded soldiers scattered behind the various vehicles. Private Johnson was lying motionless behind the second Humvee, and she could see blood pooling beneath him. Specialist Rodriguez was sitting upright but clutching his leg, his face pale with shock. A third soldier, Private Chen, was conscious but had a head wound that was bleeding heavily. "Where's the enemy fire coming from?" Sarah asked Torres as she opened her medical bag. "Up in those rocks, about 300 meters. We think there's at least 6 of them, maybe more. They've got us pinned down good." Sarah looked at the tactical situation. The convoy was trapped in a natural bowl between the rocky hills with enemy fighters on the high ground. The QRF was providing covering fire, but they couldn't advance without risking heavy casualties. "I need to get to Johnson first," Sarah said. "He looks the worst." Torres grabbed her arm. "Martinez, that's 30 meters of open ground. You'll never make it." Sarah looked at the distance between her position and Johnson. The young soldier who had asked her about her instincts was lying completely still, and she could see his blood spreading across the dusty ground. Every second of delay could mean the difference between life and death. "I have to try," she said simply. Before Torres could stop her, Sarah was moving again. She sprinted toward Johnson's position, her medical bag clutched tightly in one hand. Enemy bullets cracked past her head, and she heard Torres shouting for covering fire from the other soldiers. She slid into position behind Johnson's cover, just as a volley of shots struck the ground inches from her feet. Johnson was unconscious, and she could see immediately that he had taken a bullet to the abdomen. Blood was soaking through his uniform and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Sarah's training kicked in completely. She cut away Johnson's uniform to expose the wound, applied pressure to control the bleeding, and started an IV line to combat shock. Her movements were precise and confident, even as bullets continued to fly overhead. "Johnson, can you hear me?" she called out as she worked. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. "Doc? That you?" "Yeah, it's me. You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay with me, okay?" Johnson nodded weakly. Sarah could see that the bullet had passed through his abdomen, which was both good and bad news. Good because there was no bullet to remove. Bad because there could be significant internal damage. She applied a pressure dressing to both the entry and exit wounds, then gave Johnson a dose of morphine for pain. As she worked, she could hear the ongoing firefight around them. The QRF was trying to advance up the hillside, but the enemy position was too well fortified. "Martinez," Torres called out from his position. "How's Johnson?" "He's stable for now, but I need to get him evacuated," Sarah replied. "What's the ETA on the medevac?" 20 minutes, came the reply from one of the QRF soldiers. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours if they couldn't get out of this kill zone. Sarah looked around, studying the terrain and the enemy positions. She had an idea, but it was dangerous. She keyed her radio. "This is Martinez. I think I can get to higher ground and spot for you. There's a trail up the left side of the hill that might give us a flanking position." "Negative, Martinez," Torres replied immediately. "You're a medic, not infantry." "I'm a soldier first," Sarah shot back. "And right now we need to get these wounded out of here." She looked at Johnson, whose eyes were becoming glassy despite the morphine. Rodriguez was still conscious but losing blood from his leg wound. Chen's head injury needed attention, but it wasn't immediately life-threatening. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She grabbed her rifle, checked her ammunition, and prepared to do something that would shock everyone who thought they knew her. The quiet medic who studied medical journals by flashlight was about to become something entirely different. "Torres, I'm going up that hill. Give me covering fire in 30 seconds. Before anyone could object, Sarah was moving again, but this time she wasn't running to treat wounded soldiers. She was advancing toward the enemy, and for the first time since the ambush began, she wasn't thinking like a medic. She was thinking like a warrior. Sarah moved up the rocky slope with a grace that surprised even her. All those months of carrying heavy medical equipment had built strength in her legs and core that served her well now. She used every piece of cover available, moving from boulder to boulder, always staying low and quiet. The enemy fighters were focused on the convoy below, which gave her a crucial advantage. She could hear them shouting to each other in Pashto, coordinating their fire. From her new position, she could see that there were actually 7 fighters, not 6 as Torres had estimated. They had positioned themselves well, with overlapping fields of fire that made any frontal assault extremely costly. Sarah found a position behind a large rock outcropping that gave her a clear view of 3 enemy positions. She keyed her radio and whispered, "QRF, this is Martinez. I have eyes on enemy positions. 3 fighters at grid 1 and 23-456, approximately 200 meters from your position." Corporal Davis responded immediately. "Martinez, what the hell are you doing up there? Get back to the wounded." "The wounded are stable for now," Sarah replied, "but they're going to die if we don't break this ambush. I can see positions that you can't hit from down there." She studied the enemy fighters through her rifle scope. They were well equipped and disciplined, taking turns providing covering fire while others repositioned. These weren't amateur insurgents. They were experienced fighters who had planned this ambush carefully. One of the Taliban fighters was in an exposed position, trying to get a better angle on the convoy. Sarah lined up her shot, controlled her breathing the way she had been taught in basic training, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the rocky landscape, and the enemy fighter dropped. The others immediately began looking around, trying to locate the source of the fire. Sarah had already moved to a new position before they could spot her. "Good shot, Martinez," came Torres's voice over the radio. "Can you see the others?" Sarah was already lining up her second shot. Another Taliban fighter had exposed himself, trying to get a better view of her previous position. She fired again and he fell backward behind the rocks. Now the remaining fighters knew they were being flanked. Sarah could hear them shouting, and 2 of them began moving toward her position. She had perhaps 60 seconds before they reached her. "QRF, advance now," she called into her radio. "They're repositioning to deal with me. You've got a clear shot at their main position." The quick reaction force immediately began their assault up the hill. Sarah continued to provide covering fire, picking off targets as they presented themselves. Her marksmanship training, which she had always excelled at but never needed to use in combat, was proving invaluable. A Taliban fighter appeared around a boulder just 20 meters from her position, his AK-47 raised and ready. Sarah spun and fired in one smooth motion, the muscle memory from countless hours on the firing range taking over. The fighter dropped his weapon and fell. "Martinez, you've got 2 more coming up on your left," Torres called out. He had moved to a position where he could see the hillside better. Sarah looked left and saw 2 fighters moving quickly through the rocks toward her. She fired at the first one and saw him stumble, but the second one had found good cover and was returning fire. Bullets struck the rocks around her, sending sharp fragments flying. She duck-walked to a new position, staying low as rounds cracked overhead. The remaining Taliban fighter was well-trained and patient, waiting for her to expose herself. Sarah realized she was in a classic sniper duel, something she had studied but never experienced. The QRF was advancing steadily up the hill, but they were still 2 minutes away from reaching the main enemy position. Sarah needed to keep the pressure on to prevent the Taliban fighters from reorganizing their defense. She spotted movement in her peripheral vision and turned to see the wounded Taliban fighter she had hit earlier. He was crawling toward a dropped rifle, leaving a trail of blood on the rocks. Sarah had a clear shot, but something made her hesitate. Instead of firing, she called out in Arabic, one of the languages she had studied in preparation for deployment. "Stop moving. You're badly wounded. Surrender and I'll treat your injuries." The fighter looked up at her, surprise evident on his face. For a moment, the sound of gunfire seemed to fade as they stared at each other across the rocky slope. Then the fighter slowly raised his hands. Sarah kept her rifle trained on him as she called for the QRF. "I've got a wounded enemy fighter. He's surrendering." "Martinez," Davis's voice crackled through the radio. "The area isn't secure yet." "I know," Sarah replied, "but he's bleeding out." I took an oath to preserve life. Even in the middle of a firefight, even after proving she could kill when necessary, Sarah Martinez was still, fundamentally, a medic. The last Taliban fighter in the main position was still shooting at the advancing QRF. But Sarah found herself torn between her duty as a soldier and her calling as a healer. It was a decision that would define not just the outcome of the battle, but how her fellow soldiers would see her forever. Sarah made her choice in an instant. She moved toward the wounded Taliban fighter, keeping her rifle ready but pulling her medical kit from her belt with her free hand. The man was young, perhaps 20 years old, with a bullet wound in his shoulder that was bleeding heavily. "Don't move," she told him in Arabic as she approached. The fighter's eyes were wide with pain and confusion. He had probably never seen an American soldier offer medical aid to an enemy combatant in the middle of a firefight. As Sarah began applying pressure to his wound, the last Taliban fighter in the main position fired a burst at the advancing QRF soldiers. Corporal Davis and his team were pinned down just 50 meters from the enemy position, caught in the open with limited cover. Sarah looked up from treating the wounded fighter and saw the tactical situation developing. The remaining Taliban fighter had an excellent position and was keeping the entire QRF suppressed. Her fellow soldiers were trapped, and the wounded in the convoy below were running out of time. She finished applying a pressure bandage to the Taliban fighter's shoulder and zip-tied his hands behind his back. "Stay here," she told him. "Help is coming." Then Sarah picked up her rifle and began moving toward the last enemy position. She had a flanking route that would put her behind the Taliban fighter, but it meant crossing 30 meters of open ground under potential observation. "Martinez, where are you going?" Davis called over the radio. "Finishing this," Sarah replied. She sprinted across the exposed area, using every piece of cover available. The Taliban fighter was focused on the QRF below and didn't see her approaching from behind. Sarah found a position where she could see him clearly through her scope. The fighter was young like the one she had just treated, but he was still shooting at her friends. Sarah centered the crosshairs on his back and took a deep breath. This shot would end the ambush and save American lives, but taking a shot from behind felt different from the face-to-face encounters she had already survived. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, remembering Johnson lying in his own blood and Torres calling specifically for her help. Sarah fired. The Taliban fighter slumped forward, and suddenly the hillside was quiet except for the ringing in everyone's ears. "Area secure," Davis called out as his team moved up to clear the position. Sarah immediately turned her attention back to the wounded. She half ran, half slid down the rocky slope toward the convoy, her medical bag bouncing against her hip. Johnson was still conscious but pale, and she could see that Rodriguez needed immediate attention for his leg wound. "Martinez," Torres called out as she approached. His voice carried a tone she had never heard from him before. It was respect mixed with something that might have been awe. "How's everyone doing?" Sarah asked as she knelt beside Johnson. "Better now that you're back," Johnson said weakly. "Doc, I saw what you did up there. That was incredible." Sarah checked his vitals and adjusted his IV drip. The bleeding was under control, but he needed surgery soon. "Just doing my job," she said. "That wasn't just doing your job," Torres interjected. "That was some of the finest soldiering I've ever seen." The medevac helicopter arrived 15 minutes later, and Sarah supervised the loading of all wounded personnel, including the Taliban fighter she had treated. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Johnson and the others to the field hospital, Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The convoy made it back to base without further incident, but news of what had happened at Checkpoint Charlie spread quickly. By the time Sarah reached the medical tent, soldiers were gathering around wanting to hear the story firsthand. "Is it true you took out 4 enemy fighters?" asked Private Williams. "Is it true you treated one of them after shooting him?" asked another soldier. Sarah deflected the questions and focused on writing her after-action report, but she could feel that something fundamental had changed. The soldiers who had once seen her as someone who needed protection were now looking at her with genuine respect. Colonel Harrison called her to his office that evening. "Martinez, I've been getting reports about what happened today. Corporal Davis says you single-handedly broke the ambush." "I had a lot of help, sir," Sarah replied. "The QRF did the heavy lifting." "That's not what they're saying," Harrison continued. "They're saying you flanked the enemy position alone, eliminated multiple targets, and still found time to provide medical aid to a wounded enemy combatant." Sarah didn't know how to respond to that. She had simply done what needed to be done in the moment. "I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star," Harrison said. "But more importantly, I want you to know that you've earned something you can't pin on your uniform. You've earned the respect of every soldier on this base." That night, as Sarah lay in her cot, she thought about the events of the day. She had proven that she could fight when necessary, but she had also stayed true to her calling as a healer. The combination of those two things had created something new, something that even she didn't fully understand yet. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in formation with the rest of Alpha Company as Colonel Harrison read the citation for her Bronze Star medal. The words seemed to float past her as she focused on the faces in the crowd. Johnson was there, back on light duty after his surgery. Rodriguez was still on crutches but healing well. Even the Taliban fighter she had treated was recovering in the detention facility, though she wasn't allowed to check on him directly. For exceptionally meritorious conduct in ground combat against an armed enemy, Harrison read, Staff Sergeant Martinez displayed extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty while serving as a combat medic. Sarah's promotion had come through the week before, along with orders transferring her to a special operations unit that needed someone with her unique combination of medical and combat skills. She would be leaving Forward Operating Base Chapman in 2 days. After the ceremony, Torres approached her with an expression she had never seen from him before. It took her a moment to recognize it as humility. "Martinez, I owe you an apology," he said. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about a lot of things." "You don't need to apologize, Sergeant," Sarah replied. "You were looking out for your soldiers the best way you knew how." "No, I need to say this," Torres insisted. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. You're not just a good medic or a good soldier. You're one of the best warriors I've ever served with." The word warrior hung in the air between them. It wasn't a term Sarah had ever applied to herself, but she was beginning to understand that healing and fighting weren't opposite things. Sometimes they were the same thing. Johnson approached as Torres walked away. He was moving slowly but steadily, his wound healing better than the doctors had initially expected. "Doc, I wanted to thank you again," he said, "not just for saving my life, but for showing all of us what courage really looks like." "Johnson, you don't need to thank me. We're soldiers. We take care of each other." "Yeah, but it's more than that," Johnson continued. "What you did up on that hill, the way you fought for us and then still treated that wounded fighter. I've been thinking about it a lot. My grandmother always said that true strength comes from knowing when to fight and when to heal." Sarah nodded, remembering their conversation about trusting instincts. Your grandmother sounds like she knew what she was talking about. That evening, Sarah packed her gear for the transfer to the Special Operations Unit. As she folded her uniforms, she found the letter she had written to her mother on her first day at the base. In it, she had wondered whether she was making a difference. Now she knew the answer. The next morning brought news that would put her actions into even greater perspective. Intelligence reports indicated that the ambush at Checkpoint Charlie had been planned as the opening move in a larger offensive against multiple forward operating bases. The Taliban cell she had helped eliminate had been preparing to coordinate attacks across the entire region. "Your actions may have saved hundreds of lives," Colonel Harrison told her during their final meeting. "The intelligence we gathered from the wounded fighter you treated has been invaluable." Sarah thought about that as she prepared to leave the base. She had set out to prove that she belonged in a combat zone, but she had ended up proving something much more important. She had shown that the qualities that make someone a good medic, compassion, quick thinking, dedication to preserving life, were the same qualities that could make someone an exceptional warrior. Her replacement arrived that afternoon, a young man fresh from medical training who reminded Sarah of herself 6 months earlier. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the desire to prove himself mixed with fear of not measuring up. "The most important thing to remember," she told him as she showed him around the medical facility, "is that being a medic doesn't make you less of a soldier. It makes you a different kind of soldier, one who fights for life instead of just against death." On her final evening at the base, the soldiers of Alpha Company gathered for an informal farewell. There were no speeches or official ceremonies, just soldiers sharing stories and saying goodbye to someone who had become more than a colleague. As Sarah looked around at the faces of the men who had once seen her as a liability, she saw something that meant more than any medal or commendation. She saw acceptance, respect, and genuine affection. She had found her place not by abandoning who she was, but by fully embracing it. Staff Sergeant Torres approached her one last time. Without saying a word, he came to attention and offered her a crisp military salute. One by one, the other soldiers followed suit until the entire company was standing at attention, saluting the medic who had become their hero. Sarah returned the salute, fighting back tears. She had come to Afghanistan as someone trying to prove she belonged. She was leaving as someone who had redefined what belonging meant. The next morning, as her helicopter lifted off from Forward Operating Base Chapman, Sarah looked down at the base that had become home. She thought about Johnson's grandmother and her wisdom about knowing when to fight and when to heal. Sarah Martinez had learned that sometimes the greatest warriors are those who fight not because they love war, but because they love something worth protecting. And sometimes the most powerful weapon a soldier can carry is the determination to preserve life. Even in the midst of taking it, the silent salute her fellow soldiers had given her would remain with her forever. A reminder that respect is earned not through aggression but through courage, competence, and an unwavering commitment to the mission and the people who depend on you to see it through.